Hello, my presentation today is about fantasy football. Fantasy football is an online game where players compete against each other by selecting real NFL players and position units. In order to win the game, the players you selected need to gain more points than your opponent. There are many online websites that have slightly different variations of this game, but all of them have the same overall concept. Pick NFL players that score more points than your opponent in order to win. Some websites, such as FanDuel and DraftKings, require players to bet money in order to enter the competitions. The entry fee is different for each game. The price of the entry fee is highly correlated to the prize money you could win. The higher the entry fee, the higher the prize money. The rewards range from a couple $100s to millions of dollars. Once a game has been selected, the fans enter a draft in order to select the NFL players for their team. Everyone is assigned a draft spot where they can select one player for their team. Each league is set up slightly differently but follows a general pattern of one quarterback, two running backs, two wide receivers, one tight end, a flex player, which can be a running back, wide receiver, or tight end, a kicker, and a defensive unit. Players selected earlier in the draft are expected to score more points than those selected after them. Points are awarded for the number of throwing yards, rushing yards, receiving yards, field goals, extra points, interceptions, and touchdowns made by the players. The harder the objective, the more points that are awarded. So a touchdown is worth more points than 10 rushing yards. After all of the NFL games have been played each week, the number of points each player accumulates is added together for a team total. If your team total is higher than your opponent's, you win. Some leagues last just 1 week, while others pit you against a different opponent each week until the NFL season is over. So how has fantasy football changed the NFL? Fans generally cheer for one of the 32 NFL teams because they live in the team's area. While fans still cheer for these teams, fantasy football has caused fans to cheer for individual players. Sometimes these individual players are supported more than an entire team, especially when winning money is dependent on one player's success. The players who score a lot of fantasy points become idolized, while players who aren't producing the desired stats tend to be ridiculed. For example, last year Odell Beckham Jr. became one of the stars of the NFL because of his fantasy production, while Roddy White suffers from scrutiny for not catching any passes even though he is doing exactly what his coaches want him to do. Fans are now tracking individual players more than ever before. Their goal is to find what players will score the most points for them each week. They don't care if the team wins or how other players on the same team do. People analyze the matchups, past results, and other factors in order to select the best lineup for the upcoming week. TV channels that support the NFL have changed and adapted to accommodate fantasy football. Now there are shows centered around fantasy football where analysts talk about what players they like and dislike for the upcoming weeks, such as Fantasy Football Live. Another channel, the Red Zone channel, was created to help fantasy football players track their players' progress. Since only offensive players are drafted and a player scoring a touchdown is worth the most fantasy points, there is a channel that only shows teams when they are about to score. When a team drives within 20 yards of a touchdown, they will be shown on the Red Zone channel. Another aspect of the NFL that has changed is the approach to players' safety. Recently, the NFL has received scrutiny for the amount of concussions and brain injuries current and retired NFL players have had to deal with. In fact, NFL players filed a lawsuit against the NFL and won. The new rules aim to prevent concussions, keep players on the field so they can score more fantasy points. Players can no longer tackle another player by lowering their helmet and hitting the opposing player with their helmet. If this kind of hit occurs in a game, a penalty will be awarded to the opposing team, and the player who made the hit could possibly be ejected and fined. Another rule designed to protect players is the defenseless rule. This rule is focused around a player getting hit right after throwing a ball or while making a catch on the ball. If a player is considered defenseless or unable to have the opportunity of evading a tackle, and they are hit by the opposing team, a penalty will be awarded. So how does player safety relate to fantasy football? Because of fantasy football, every injury a player develops, minor or severe, becomes noteworthy to fantasy football fans. When a player becomes injured, they have to choose whether to start them or bench them. Since so much attention is given to player injuries, fans and players began to realize that there have been way too many brain injuries and new rules need to change that. While some recent rules have been made to protect these players, other rules have been created to help offensive players succeed. One rule focuses on the interaction between wide receivers and the defensive players covering them. This rule has reduced the amount of physical contact the defensive player may apply to the receiver. This rule is unnecessary but has made it easier for wide receivers to catch the ball and therefore score more fantasy points. So why is the NFL making all these changes? Money. With over 32 million people playing fantasy football, Forbes estimates the fantasy football market to be around $15 billion, more than the NFL's annual revenue of $10 billion. The NFL reels in millions of dollars annually from the ads fantasy football companies show on channels that broadcast the NFL games. Even NFL players are paid to participate in these commercials. The NFL has even made their own fantasy football league where other companies pay to advertise on their fantasy football website. Fantasy football and the NFL couldn't succeed as well as they are today without the other companies' success. With this success, each company has been increasing their total revenue each year. In order to continue this success, the two companies should continue to look for ways to work together, since all of the previous changes the NFL has made to support fantasy football has resulted in more popularity and therefore more revenue. These changes range from alterations of the rulebook to completely new channels to the creation of the NFL's own fantasy football website. These changes enabled fantasy football fans to more effectively track their team and other players, while the offensive players stay healthy and score more points. Without fantasy football, some of these changes to the NFL would not have been made or considered helpful. Thank you.